Imagine waking up to the sound of your own death sentence. It is 1889 in the unforgiving Blackwood Valley. A naive traveller opens his eyes inside a creaking guest lodge, the floorboards shaking violently beneath him. Beside him lies a woman of immense power, the chief's daughter, her towering frame taking up the entire bed. Outside, the rhythmic, terrifying stomping of 321 warriors demands his presence. He thought he was simply being polite by carrying a heavy crate the day before. He was wrong. In this territory, spending the night is not hospitality. It is a binding marriage proposal, and the groom must now emerge or bleed. Caleb Vance, 29 years old, and possessing the lean build of a man who has spent more time dodging trouble than facing it, stared at the ceiling of the guest lodge. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of morning light seemed to mock his paralysis. Beside him, taking up nearly 2/3 of the rough-hewn mattress, slept Rowan. At 25, she was a figure of local legend and hushed fear. Her stature was towering, her shoulders broad enough to shame the blacksmiths of the valley, and her physical strength was rumored to rival that of a grizzly bear. Yet in sleep, her face held a softness that contradicted the terrifying rhythm vibrating through the floorboards. That rhythm was the synchronized stomping of boots on dry earth. It was a sound that promised violence. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, as the realization of his error washed over him with the cold dread of a winter plunge. He had only arrived in Blackwood Valley yesterday, a naive traveller with messy brown hair and a crate of wares to sell. When he saw Rowan struggling with a massive crate of supplies near the trading post, his altruistic nature took over. He didn't see a giantess. He saw a person in need. He stepped in, lifted the heavy cargo and carried it to her door. He thought the gasps of the onlookers were admiration for his chivalry. He was dead wrong. In 1889, in this secluded territory governed by ancient and brutal laws, a man does not carry a woman's burden unless he intends to carry her life as his own. He had unwittingly signed a marriage contract in sweat and labor, and the 321 warriors outside were not wedding guests. They were the witnesses to his execution should he attempt to flee. Hit the like button if you would start running for your life right now. Rowan stirred, the movement shifting the entire bed frame. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, confusion clouded her gaze before the grim reality settled in. She sat up, her massive silhouette blocking out the window, and looked down at Caleb with an expression that was terrifyingly calm. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply reached for the weathered leather vest Caleb had discarded the night before and held it out to him. Her hands, large enough to crush a man's skull, trembled ever so slightly. That tremor was the only crack in her stoic armor. She explained, her voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in Caleb's chest, that 63 men had visited this valley before him. 63 men had looked at her and seen a trophy to be won or a beast to be tamed. They had tried to wrestle her, to outdrink her, to dominate her strength with their own. They had all failed, cast out or broken. Caleb was the first, the very first in her 25 years, to simply offer help without an agenda. He had treated her with a dignity she had never known, and that accidental kindness was now the noose around his neck. Ignorance of the law was no excuse in Blackwood Valley. Refusal to walk out that door as her betrothed would be interpreted as a direct insult to her honor and the authority of her father. It was not just a rejection, it was a declaration of war against the tribe's most protected bloodline. Caleb took the vest, the leather cold against his sweating palms. He wasn't just facing a shotgun wedding, he was facing a firing squad if he dared to disrespect the customs of this land. If you were Caleb, would you marry a stranger or face the army outside? In comment your choice below. The wooden door of the lodge exploded inward. Splinters flew across the room as Chief Garrett kicked it open, his 55-year-old frame filling the entryway. The chief was an imposing figure, his skin weathered like old parchment, and his eyes sharp with a manipulative intelligence. He did not look at his daughter. His gaze was fixed solely on the merchant. "Step outside, merchant," Garrett commanded, his voice booming with the authority that demanded absolute obedience. Caleb pulled the vest over his shoulders, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, and stood up. His legs felt like lead, but his quiet, moral courage, the same trait that got him into this mess, forced him to move. He walked past Rowan, who sat frozen on the edge of the bed, her head bowed in anticipation of the shame to come. Caleb stepped out of the dark, pine-scented lodge and into the blinding morning sun of the valley. As his eyes adjusted, the blurry shapes sharpened into a terrifying semicircle of silent, armed men. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of muscle and hostility encircling the porch. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for the sign to draw their weapons. Chief Garrett stepped past Caleb, raising his arms to address the crowd. His voice carried across the plains, echoing off the distant tree line. He announced that Caleb Vance had declared his intent to join the family, not by combat or boastful challenges, but by the act of service. He told the crowd how others feared Rowan's power, how they whispered she was a monster, but that this stranger had shown her the respect due to a chief's daughter. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Garrett was painting Caleb as a hero, raising the stakes so high that a refusal now wouldn't just be an insult, it would be a betrayal of the narrative the chief was spinning. The trap was emotional as much as it was physical. Subscribe to the channel right now to see if Caleb survives this impossible standoff. The cheers were muted, skeptical. The warriors knew the game. They were waiting for the merchant to break, to run, to beg for his life. Chief Garrett lowered his arms and turned to Caleb, leaning in close until the smell of tobacco and old leather filled Caleb's nose. The booming voice dropped to a sinister whisper, meant only for the two of them. "You can leave," the chief hissed, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I will grant you safe passage to the border, but know this, merchant. If you walk away now, if you leave her standing at the altar of her own home, you confirm every whisper they say about her. You confirm that she is unlovable, that she is a beast unfit for a man." Caleb looked out at the sneering warriors, men who were waiting for him to humiliate her so they could feel superior to the woman who could physically best them all. Then he looked back at the open doorway of the lodge. Rowan had stood up. She was framed in the darkness, her massive shoulders hunched, bracing herself for the inevitable rejection. She looked small for the first time. Caleb Vance took a breath that tasted of dust and destiny. He looked at the horizon where freedom lay, and then at the woman whose dignity was currently held in his trembling hands. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy, as the merchant prepared to make a choice that would decide his fate forever. Like, subscribe, and check the pinned comment for the next part of this saga. The air in the valley seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum of suffocating heat that pressed against Caleb's chest. He stepped off the porch, his boot crunching into the dry red earth, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the unnatural silence. He did not walk toward the horizon where safety and a life of mediocrity awaited him. Instead, he turned his body, deliberate and slow, to face Garrett. The chief's eyes narrowed, the crinkles around them deepening not with amusement, but with the sharp calculation of a predator watching prey walk willingly into a trap. Caleb stopped mere inches from the older man, close enough to see the coarse texture of his skin and the utter lack of mercy in his gaze. "I stay," Caleb said. His voice was not a boom like the chief's, nor a growl like the warriors. It was quiet, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "I will not be the reason she bows her head." A ripple of shock tore through the assembly. The warriors shifted, hands tightening on rifles and tomahawks. They had expected the merchant to run. They had bet on his cowardice. By staying, Caleb had not just accepted a marriage. He had challenged their collective assumption of his weakness. Garrett stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a dark, theatrical laugh erupted from his chest, startling a flock of crows from the nearby pines. He clapped a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder, the grip crushing, meant to hurt rather than comfort. "He stays!" Garrett roared to the crowd, turning the tension into a spectacle. The merchant believes he has the spine of a warrior. He believes he is worthy of the blood of Blackwood. The crowd did not cheer. They murmured, a low, buzzing sound of dissent and anticipation. Garrett leaned in again, his voice dropping to a serpentine whisper that chilled Caleb's blood, despite the morning sun. "You are a fool," Garrett hissed. "You think this is noble? You think this is a fairy tale? By sunset, you will wish you had run. Because now, you must prove you can keep what you have claimed." Garrett shoved Caleb forward, sending him stumbling into the center of the clearing. "Prepare the yoke," the chief commanded. The words caused Rowan to gasp audibly from the doorway. She rushed forward, her heavy boots thudding against the planks, ignoring the protocol that demanded her silence. She looked terrified. Her immense frame, usually a source of intimidation, now trembled with genuine fear for the man standing alone in the dirt. She grabbed her father's arm, her knuckles white. "Father, no," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "He is a traveler. He is not of the valley. The yoke will kill him." Garrett backhanded her hand away, not with violence, but with a sharp, dismissive gesture that stung more than a blow. "He chose this, daughter. If he cannot bear the weight of the tribe, he cannot bear the weight of you. Do not shame him further with your pity." Rowan looked at Caleb, her eyes wide and wet. She shook her head slowly, a silent plea for him to recant, to run while the horses were still tied. But Caleb straightened his leather vest, dusting off the dirt. He looked at Rowan, really looked at her, seeing not the beast the others saw, but a woman trapped in a cage of expectations. He gave her a small, trembling nod. Two warriors emerged from the tree line, dragging a massive, rough-hewn log of ironwood. It was a device of torture, disguised as a tool, thick chains bolted to either end. It was designed to be pulled by an ox or two strong men during the harvest. The bark was jagged, the wood dense and unforgiving. They dropped it in the dust with a ground-shaking thud that vibrated through the soles of Caleb's boots. "The tradition is simple," Garrett announced, pacing around Caleb like a ringmaster. "To marry into the chief's line is to carry the burden of the people. You carried supplies yesterday. Good. Today, you carry the foundation. You will drag the yoke from the guest lodge to the ancestral burial grounds at the ridge. If you stop, you fail. If you fall and do not rise by the count of 3, you fail. And if you fail," Garrett paused, smiling grimly, "the marriage is annulled by death." The ridge was a mile away, entirely uphill, over terrain littered with sharp rocks and hidden roots. For a man of Caleb's build, lean, accustomed to sitting on wagons rather than pulling them, it was an impossible task. It was an execution. A warrior spat at Caleb's feet as he approached the log. "Go home, little man," he sneered. "She will break you in the bed, so we will break you here first." Caleb ignored him. He knelt in the dirt, the smell of pine and sweat filling his nose. He grabbed the rough iron chains. They were cold and heavy, biting into his palms instantly. He wrapped them around his forearms, securing his grip. He didn't look at the sneering faces. He didn't look at the steep incline of the path ahead. He focused on the wood grain of the log. He had to move it, just once, then again. "Begin!" Garrett shouted. Caleb lunged forward, driving his legs into the earth. The chains snapped taut. The log didn't move. Laughter erupted from the semicircle. It was a cruel, barking sound. Caleb gritted his teeth, his boots slipping in the loose dust. He leaned his entire body weight forward, almost parallel to the ground, straining until the veins in his neck bulged like cords. He groaned, a guttural sound of pure exertion. Slowly, agonizingly, the ironwood groaned back. It shifted, then it slid. A hush fell over the front row. Caleb took a step, then another. The friction was immense. It felt like pulling a mountain. Every muscle in his back screamed in protest, firing with a burning heat that rivaled the sun overhead. He dragged the weight past the porch where Rowan stood. She wasn't watching the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on his struggling form, her hands covering her mouth to stifle a cry. The first 100 yards were pure adrenaline. Caleb focused on his breathing, a rhythm he had learned from long days of travel. Step, pull, breathe. But the Blackwood Valley was not kind. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth until heat radiated from the ground in shimmering waves. Sweat poured into Caleb's eyes, stinging and blinding him. The leather vest became a furnace, trapping his body heat, but he couldn't stop to remove it. As the incline began, the gravity of his situation truly set in. The log felt like it was gaining weight with every inch. His boots, worn from travel, began to lose traction on the rocky slope. He slipped, his knee slamming into a jagged stone. The impact tore his trousers and skin, blood instantly darkening the fabric. "One!" Garrett's voice boomed from behind him. Caleb scrambled, his fingernails digging into the dirt, trying to find purchase. The chain slackened, and the log began to slide backward, threatening to crush his ankles. "Two!" With a roar of frustration, Caleb threw his weight forward again, the chains biting deep into his flesh, tearing the skin of his wrists. He caught the momentum just before the log rolled over him. He stood up, his legs trembling violently. The laughter had died down, replaced by a morbid curiosity. They were watching a man destroy himself. He continued. Time distorted. Minutes stretched into hours. The world narrowed down to the patch of dirt directly in front of his face. His lungs burned as if he were inhaling broken glass. His vision began to tunnel, dark spots dancing at the edges of his sight. He was a merchant, a man of numbers and maps, not a beast of burden. His body was failing. He reached the halfway point, a cluster of twisted oak trees known as the Watchers. Here, the path narrowed and grew steeper. A group of warriors had gathered there, betting on exactly where he would collapse. As Caleb dragged his burden past them, one of the men subtly kicked a large rock in front of the log. The wood caught the stone. The sudden stop jerked Caleb back violently. The chain whipped against his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. He fell hard, face first into the dust, tasting copper and grit. Garrett shouted, "Closer now!" The chief was following him, enjoying the show. Caleb gasped for air, but his chest wouldn't expand. His ribs felt cracked. The pain was a blinding white light in his mind. "Stay down," a voice in his head whispered. "Stay down and they might just banish you. Get up and you die." He looked up through the haze of pain. He saw Rowan. She had followed, walking alongside the procession but kept back by the guards. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at him with an intensity that burned. She mimicked a breathing motion, inhaling slowly, exhaling. She was trying to pace him. She was fighting with him in the only way she could. Caleb saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. She knew what it was like to be judged, to be watched, to be waiting for the moment you broke. If he stayed down, he proved them right about her, too, that she was only fit for weak men who crumbled. Caleb Vance spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the boot of the warrior who had kicked the rock. With a groan that sounded more animal than human, he forced his body off the ground. He didn't just stand, he threw himself against the chains with a renewed manic energy. The log jumped over the obstruction, scraping loudly against the stone. The warrior stepped back, startled by the ferocity in the merchant's eyes. Caleb wasn't just enduring anymore, he was angry. He dragged the weight up the steepest section. His muscles were spasming uncontrollably. His hands were slick with blood, making the chains slippery. He had to wrap the iron links around his forearms again, cutting off circulation, turning his hands into purple, swollen claws. But he didn't stop. The summit was in sight, the burial grounds. But between him and the finish line lay the Devil's Step, a shelf of slick slate rock with almost no traction. Garrett moved to the front, standing at the top of the ridge, looking down. "Give up, merchant!" he called out, his voice almost bored. "You have made a good show. No one will call you a coward, but you cannot climb the step with that weight. It is physics. You are light. The wood is heavy. You will slide, and it will crush you. Walk away." Caleb paused at the base of the slate. He was swaying. He looked at the smooth rock. The chief was right. If he tried to walk up it, he would slip. He didn't have the mass to generate the friction needed. He looked at the crate of supplies he had carried yesterday. The memory of it. He remembered the leverage. He remembered how he had moved heavy barrels on the docks back east, not by lifting them, but by turning them. Caleb unhooked one side of the chain. The crowd gasped. Was he quitting? He forfeits. A warrior shouted, drawing a knife. "Wait!" Rowan's voice cut through the noise. Caleb didn't drop the chain. He shortened it. He walked to the back of the log. He wasn't going to pull it. He crouched low, placing his shoulder against the end of the ironwood. He wasn't going to drag it up the slate. He was going to push it end over end. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. If the log slipped while he was below it, it would flatten him instantly. "He is mad," Garrett muttered, his eyes widening slightly. Caleb screamed a raw sound of defiance and drove his legs upward. He lifted the end of the log. It was impossibly heavy. His spine compressed, but the log rose. He tipped it. It slammed down onto the slate a few feet higher. He scrambled up, wedged his shoulder under it again, and heaved. Slam. Higher. The warriors fell silent. The rhythmic thud of the wood against the stone was the only sound in the valley. Caleb was no longer a man. He was a machine driven by a singular refusal to accept the narrative written for him. He was rewriting the story with every agonizing inch. He was 10 feet from the top. His vision was gone. He was moving on instinct. He heaved one last time, but his foot slipped on a patch of moss. He fell. The log teetered on the edge of the slate, balanced precariously, ready to roll back down and crush him into paste. Caleb scrambled, sliding backward, helpless. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see the log hovering, defying gravity for a split second. Then it tipped forward, over the crest of the ridge, landing safely on the flat grass of the burial grounds. Caleb lay on the slate, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He hadn't pushed it that last inch. He couldn't have. He rolled over, looking up at the summit. Rowan stood there. She had not touched the log. That would have disqualified him. But she had stomped her foot on the ground hard, right next to the balancing wood. The vibration, the sheer force of her impact on the earth, had been just enough to disturb the balance and tip it forward. It was a secret shared in the dust, a defiance of the law without breaking the letter of it. Caleb crawled over the lip of the ridge and collapsed beside the log. He was bloodied, bruised, and barely conscious. He looked up. A forest of legs surrounded him. The entire tribe had gathered. Chief Garrett stood over him, his face a mask of thunder. He looked at the log, then at his daughter, and finally at the merchant who lay broken but alive at his feet. The silence was absolute. The test was over. But the look in Garrett's eyes said the danger had only just begun. He had wanted Caleb to fail. Caleb's success was not a victory. It was an insult to the chief's control. Garrett drew a long, serrated knife from his belt. The sound of metal leaving leather hissed through the quiet air. He stepped toward Caleb, who was too weak to stand, too weak to defend himself. "You have moved the wood," Garrett said softly, raising the blade so it glinted in the harsh sunlight. But now we must see if you have the blood to bind the contract." Rowan stepped forward, her massive shadow engulfing Caleb, placing herself between her father's knife and her betrothed. For the first time, the beast of Blackwood Valley bared her teeth, not at a stranger, but at her own king. The blade in Garrett's hand did not lower. If anything, the chief's grip tightened, his knuckles turning the color of old bone against the leather handle. The air in Blackwood Valley had grown stagnant, heavy with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of imminent violence. Rowan stood like a statue carved from the mountain itself, her chest heaving not from exertion, but from the magnitude of her defiance. She had never disobeyed a direct order in front of the council, let alone the entire warrior caste. To protect a stranger was treason. To protect a man who had already humiliated the chief by succeeding was a declaration of war. Garrett stepped closer, the serrated edge of his knife hovering inches from his daughter's throat. He did not look at her, but through her, his eyes locked on the battered merchant trying to find purchase on the slate behind her. Caleb groaned, a low, guttural sound that scraped against the silence. His legs were jelly, his spine felt fused together by agony, but the sight of the steel near Rowan's neck injected a shot of adrenaline into his bloodstream that bypassed his exhaustion entirely. He could not let her bleed for him. He had carried the crate, he had moved the log. The debt was his. With a trembling hand, Caleb reached out and gripped Rowan's shoulder. The contact was electric. She flinched, not out of fear but surprise, turning her head slightly to see him rising. He looked like a corpse that had refused the grave, covered in mud, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead, his clothes torn to ribbons. But he was standing. He used her immense frame for support only for a second before pushing himself away, staggering sideways so he was no longer shielded by her body. He presented himself to the chief, swaying like a sapling in a gale, but upright. Garrett sneered, lowering the knife from Rowan's space to point it directly at Caleb's chest. The chief spoke, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than his shout ever could. He mocked Caleb, asking if the merchant was in such a hurry to die that he would crawl out from behind a woman's skirts to meet the blade. He called Caleb a broken thing, a man made of paper in a world of iron. The warriors circling them chuckled, a dry, rattling sound, but their eyes were not mocking. They were watching the merchant's hands. They were watching his eyes. Caleb took a breath that rattled in his bruised ribs. He looked at the knife, then up at the man wielding it. He stated clearly, his voice cracking but audible, that the law required blood to seal the union, not death. He demanded the chief honor the code he claimed to protect. It was a gamble of the highest order. Caleb was quoting tribal law to the man who wrote it. Garrett's face twisted in rage. He had expected begging. He had expected flight. He had not expected a lecture on jurisprudence from a man who could barely keep his eyes open. The chief lunged. It was not a killing blow, but a punishing one, a vicious slash aimed at Caleb's face to mark him, to scar him, to make him hideous, so that even if he lived, he would be a visible reminder of the chief's power. Rowan screamed, a sound of pure fury, but she was too slow to stop the initial strike. Caleb did not flinch. He did not duck. He raised his left hand, palm open, and caught the blade. The sound of steel slicing through flesh made the front row of warriors wince. The knife bit deep, grinding against the metacarpals. Blood, bright and hot, erupted from Caleb's grip, running down his wrist and dripping onto the grey slate of the burial grounds. Caleb did not let go. He clamped his fingers around the serrated steel, trapping the weapon in his own flesh. His eyes watered, his knees buckled, but he held the chief's gaze with a ferocity that silenced the wind itself. He told Garrett that the blood was paid. He squeezed the blade harder, the crimson flow turning into a steady stream. He asked if the contract was signed. Garrett tried to yank the knife back, but the serrations were caught in the bone and sinew of Caleb's grip. For a heartbeat, the two men were locked in a grotesque handshake, connected by the very weapon intended to divide them. The chief looked into Caleb's eyes and saw something he had not seen in 63 suitors. He saw a man who was not afraid of pain if it meant keeping his word. He saw a man who valued Rowan not as a prize to be won, but as a partner to be bled for. Rowan stepped forward. She did not strike her father. She simply placed her massive hand over Garrett's hand on the hilt of the knife. Her grip was like a vice. She looked her father in the eye and told him it was enough. She said the valley had seen the blood. She said the ancestors were satisfied. Her voice was not pleading. It was final. It was the voice of a future matriarch. Garrett looked around. The 321 warriors were no longer sneering. They were nodding. A murmur went through the crowd. The merchant had not run. He had moved the mountain, and now he had given his blood without a whimper. In the brutal logic of Blackwood Valley, Caleb Vance had just ceased to be a stranger. He had passed the threshold of pain that separated the tourists from the tribe. With a snarl of frustration, Garrett released the handle. Caleb staggered back, the knife still embedded in his palm, gasping as the sudden lack of resistance nearly sent him toppling over the ridge. Rowan caught him, her arms, thick with muscle and scarred from years of labor, wrapped around him with a tenderness that belied her strength. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the knife in his hand, her eyes filling with tears she refused to shed. Garrett stood alone, in the center of the slate circle. His authority had not been overthrown, but it had been checked. He looked at his daughter, holding the broken man, and realized with a cold shock that she was no longer his to command. She belonged to herself, and she had chosen to share that self with the outsider. The chief spat on the ground, a gesture of dismissal, and turned his back. He announced to the crowd that the ceremony was concluded. He walked away toward the lodge, his heavy boots thudding against the earth, a king retreating to his castle to nurse a wounded ego. The warriors dispersed slowly, many of them pausing to nod at Caleb as they passed. It was a silent salute, an acknowledgement of the crazy courage it took to catch a chief's blade. Rowan gently guided Caleb to sit on the flat rock, where the log had finally come to rest. She knelt before him, her large frame blocking out the harsh sun. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she reached for the handle of the knife. She told him to look at her, not at the wound. She told him to breathe. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. In the chaos of the last 24 hours, he had only seen her size, her strength, her intimidation factor. Now he saw the amber flecks in her brown eyes. He saw the worry lines etched around her mouth. He saw a woman who had spent her life being treated as a utility, a weapon or a monster, now looking at him as if he were the most precious thing in the world, because he had simply stayed. She pulled the knife free in one swift motion. Caleb cried out, his head falling forward onto her shoulder. She pressed a strip of cloth torn from her own tunic against the wound, applying pressure, her murmurs of apology lost in the ringing of his ears. As the pain subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, Caleb lifted his head. The valley stretched out before them, green and endless, the shadows of the pines lengthening as the afternoon wore on. He was trapped here, technically. He was bound by blood and law to a life he hadn't chosen, in a place that could kill him a dozen different ways before breakfast. He looked at his hand, wrapped in Rowan's cloth, and then at the woman who was still holding it, as if she feared he might vanish if she let go. He realized then that the fear was gone. The dread of the execution, the terror of the log, the intimidation of the chief, it had all evaporated the moment he caught the blade. He wasn't a prisoner. He had fought for this spot. He had bled for this seat on the rock. Rowan asked him quietly why he hadn't just walked away when the chief gave him the chance. She asked why he didn't leave her to the rumors and the shame, which she could have borne as she always had. Caleb leaned back against the log he had nearly died moving. He watched a hawk circling the thermal currents above the ridge. He told her that the world outside was full of people who would never understand the strength it took to carry the weight she carried every day. He said he was tired of walking away from things just because they were heavy. Rowan looked at him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since he had opened his eyes in her bed, she smiled. It wasn't a polite smile or a guarded one. It was radiant, transforming her stoic face into something breathtakingly beautiful. She squeezed his uninjured hand, her fingers engulfing his. They sat there as the sun dipped below the peaks of Blackwood Valley, two outcasts who had forged a sanctuary out of a death sentence. The rhythmic stomping of the warriors was gone, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the grass. Caleb Vance closed his eyes, listening to the heartbeat of the woman beside him, and knew that for the first time in his wandering life, he had absolutely nowhere else he needed to be. Hit the like button if you want to see how they survived the army, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.